I need something more real.
I don't have anything else, but else will do fine.
No, they won't.
Else will do fine.
No, they won't. What, you think you're some kind of Jedi waving your hand around like that? I'm a didn't. Mind tricks don't work on me. Only money.
A few moments later.
In Blizzard's attempt to create classes that are cool, flashy, and fun to play, they ultimately create classes that are unbalanced. As a result, some classes inevitably rise to the top, while other classes languish at the bottom. This creates what is commonly referred to in the WoW community as FOTM, or Flavor of the Month, where a large portion of the community flocks to the most currently overpowered class so they can have the advantage over everyone else in terms of performance, whether it be player versus player related or player versus environment. This leads to situations where a chosen few classes flood the servers and overtake battlegrounds, raids, dungeons, and other forms of content throughout the game, and fosters an environment where the current most powerful classes terrorize the weaker ones, dominating other players in every area of the game, not necessarily due to their own ability or skill, but simply because their class is overpowered.
By the power of Grayskull.
3 weeks later.
The individuals who participate in this Flavor of the Month style of play are often despised by the community, and what's even worse in some cases is that people who have always played whatever class happens to be currently on top receive undue hate and are mislabeled as slimy opportunists simply for playing the character they've always loved. This goes on for a wildly varying period of time until enough of the fan base cries out all at once for the injustice to end and Blizzard attempts to make adjustments, which typically result in either changes that are essentially meaningless or changes so profound they result in the destruction of your character to the point that all of your attacks feel like slapping someone with a wet noodle. While simultaneously, the previously weak classes become the new overpowered mega class that everyone flocks to, and the cycle inevitably continues. It can be incredibly frustrating to put so much time and effort into a particular character, only to have the latest changes ruin your chances of that character even being playable. This creates a culture of anxiety and whiplash where you're in a constant state of highs and lows and always living in fear that you might be the next unfortunate target. It creates an abusive relationship with the game that ultimately leaves many players exhausted and dissatisfied. People eagerly anticipate patch notes like a group of starving refugees surrounding the last source of water in a post-apocalyptic wasteland. And every time, there are those who jump for joy and those who have complete meltdowns. This constant chasing of a moving goalpost creates a community in constant competition, with patch updates arriving on what seems almost a daily basis and endless tier lists being created to try and keep up with the ever-shifting balance of the game. Players find themselves being ping-ponged back and forth, desperately hoping they aren't the next victim unsuspectingly caught up in the destructive cycle. Which leads me to a question that so many of us are asking, a question we've been asking for a very long time. Will Blizzard ever balance the game?
Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
This almost seems to be an unsolvable mystery, like a cold case that gets further and further away from any hope of ever being solved with each passing year. It may seem like a question that is impossible to answer, but I believe it can be done, and it won't take me 20 years to do it. It won't even take me 20 minutes. In fact, I can answer that question right here and now. Will Blizzard ever balance the game? The answer is simple. No, they won't balance the game. Now that I've answered the question you came here for, I want to make my case for why I think this answer is correct. I'm not going to be focusing on bashing Blizzard for not balancing the game, but rather, my focus will be on why it's essentially an impossible task. I'm going to start with what might be the most controversial point. I know, and you know, there's a clear divide in the community when it comes to old Blizzard and new Blizzard, and also old WoW versus new WoW. While many points could be made that I would probably agree with, I'm not here to make an argument for which is better. I'm here to make a point that this line of argument can and will derail this conversation if it isn't addressed right off the bat. Regardless of whether you think Blizzard did a better job of class balance back then versus now, the honest truth is that the game was never actually balanced to begin with. Even back in the beginning, and in the midst of the glory days of WoW, this was still a massive pain point for Blizzard. Addressing class balance has always been an incredibly difficult task, and we don't have to look very hard to find clear evidence of this. Just look at the game back in the vanilla days. There were classes that were so unbalanced, it was insane. And even beyond that, all the way up to the Wrath of the Lich King days, there were major balancing issues. I'm looking at you, DKs. So, anyone who is being honest with themselves will agree that the game has always had a balancing issue. But what I want to uncover are the reasons why. Why has class balance always been so difficult to address? Well, let's start with the point that I think is the most obvious. Back in 2004, World of Warcraft was a new franchise. Warcraft started out as an RTS, or real-time strategy. So implementing this world into an MMO was not only new for the Warcraft series, but new to Blizzard as a developer. There was no pre-established formula to go by, and there was no rulebook. In fact, Blizzard actually went well beyond what the established genre of MMOs had available at the time. They implemented new ideas, and in many respects, their innovations helped in paving the way for the genre moving forward. With all of this being new and essentially uncharted territory, it stands to reason that there would be some unforeseen problems. Of course, there would be a lot of trial and error, as we all attempted to navigate this exciting and perilous new world of persistent online gaming. Now, we could just focus on some of the balancing issues within certain aspects of the game, especially when it comes to the endgame. But in order to get this into proper perspective, we have to account for the fact that WoW in its original incarnation was vastly different from the current version. There was a fundamental difference in focus in regards to gameplay. World of Warcraft in its original state was, as the name suggests, largely about the world, which makes perfect sense. Where the focus of the RTS series was on large armies, gathering resources, and a large-scale epic story to go along with the gameplay, World of Warcraft was an entirely different animal. Naturally, an MMO gave us a chance to zoom in and actually become one of the units, immerse ourselves in the world and the lore, and explore the world of Azeroth up close and personal. At its core, it was a fantasy RPG, and that meant that the progression and fulfillment of a particular role was the main focus. The bulk of the game, and the content available, all focused on RPG elements like leveling, getting gear, learning new abilities, story, quests, and exploration. This all took quite a while to experience, and by the time you got to max level, the majority of the experience with the game wouldn't have been any of the endgame content that we're familiar with today. Level cap content felt like a fraction of the game compared to the leveling experience. And even at max level, things you do in the game were still centered around the same approach. The world was so large that there was still a lot to explore, and there wasn't really so much of a dividing line between early game and end game like there is today. Back then, what you did in the early game also applied to end game. There wasn't really that much of a distinction between low level and high level. Progression and exploration was just the game overall. World of Warcraft was the experience of the world and the people in it more than anything. That said, of course Blizzard did have certain content geared specifically toward max level players, but it wasn't a constant game of give me new content, and this highly systemized construct meant to desperately drip feed you on an optimized schedule to keep you logging in every day. So with the focus not being on quote-unquote endgame as a thing, there were naturally some things Blizzard didn't necessarily anticipate in this large and complex world, which is no surprise. There was simply no way of anticipating all the ways players would interact with the behemoth of a world they created. No matter how well you plan for things to go, players always have a way of surprising you and with this in mind, it makes sense that the focus of balancing would largely apply to the bulk of the game, which was the progression experience rather than endgame. And while some classes were seemingly balanced throughout the leveling experience and into the early endgame, when certain classes got endgame gear, they became unstoppable monsters, like warriors in vanilla, who seemed pretty weak all throughout the game until they actually geared up. Then they were wrecking fools left and right. Or, as another example, what they used to call the 3-minute mage. Even though I played vanilla and mained a mage, I missed these glory days. I didn't hit max until just before Burning Crusade, and with my mage being my main, and me not having the knowledge or resources to jazz up my character, my gear was always pretty shoddy, so to me, mages never really felt overpowered. I'm a little sad, and maybe just a bit salty, that I never got to experience the true power while I had the chance. Oh well, I've seen some old footage, and it's completely nuts. Part of me wishes I could have experienced that for myself. Or maybe I'm better off never having experienced a taste of what could have been, only to be disappointed when the nerfs came. But I'm getting off on a tangent here. Back to the subject at hand. My point is that it makes perfect sense, with the focus being elsewhere, and so many things to try and keep up with in an MMO, that the relatively minor issue of late-game balancing was probably lower on Blizzard's to-do list, assuming it was even on their radar. With a game this expansive, there are so many potential issues, so many people doing unpredictable things, and an ever-expanding audience that is straining your resources to the max, that there ends up being so much that you just can't account for until it's happening in real time. When we consider this, it makes perfect sense that balance might be something hard to rein in. So I think we could give them a bit of a break when it comes to early balancing. And that's only when considering one major aspect. Another thing that we have to understand is that WoW is not, and never has been, a player versus player focused experience. Ultimately, when it comes to Blizzard as a whole, their strengths are focused in particular areas. While I think they typically do a pretty good job of adding a fairly robust PvP element to many of their games, their forte is in the story, world building, exploration, and cinematic departments. These are the aspects they truly excel at and where their focus is best applied, which is the case with World of Warcraft. There was a lot of fun to be had with PvP, particularly in world PvP in my opinion, but that was always more of a secondary aspect of the game. With progression being the heart of WoW, it made sense that naturally this would lead to a much greater focus on PvE content in general, and in regards to the endgame content. When it comes to balancing classes, while faithfully applying their lore and class fantasy, and simultaneously making each class unique and fun, it would make sense, based on what matters most to Blizzard, that these aspects would be of greater importance to the developers than having everything perfectly equal in terms of power. I can see why their focus would be on fun over balance. In my eyes, it makes sense to sacrifice a little bit of power balance for the sake of keeping the game as fun as possible. Look at the original Halo, for example. The pistol and assault rifle are overpowered weapons, and even the implementation of grenades. It wasn't a secret, everyone knew it, but that's a huge part of what made Halo so much fun. Bungie addressed these so-called problems in later games, and it fundamentally altered the experience and gameplay, very much for the worse in my opinion. I'm still a little bit salty about the change to grenades. They were so much faster and more responsive in the original game, and by Halo 3, they felt so awkward and floaty that it felt like tossing a badminton into a strong wind by hand. I hated trying to stick people in later Halo games. I put in the hours to become extremely skilled with grenades in Halo Combat Evolved, but every time Bungie changed it, I got worse and worse at landing grenade kills, and the game feel for me just felt so much worse in comparison. It was so disappointing, and to add insult to injury, when they finally released the remastered version, I was so excited because I could finally go back to the grenades of the Combat Evolved era, but they replaced the classic player versus player with the new stuff, and it was garbage grenades all over again. Get that crap stain out of here. Anyway, I'm going off on a tangent again, but I think it does a good job of demonstrating my point. It's well worth it in many cases to let the balance slide in certain areas for the sake of fun. That alone has merit, I think, but what really makes this position much stronger, especially in the early days of WoW, is that the game overall was so much more relaxed and casual. We have to remember, while early WoW may seem hardcore by today's standards, back then MMOs were super hardcore and quite punishing. But one of Blizzard's main goals with World of Warcraft was to open up this world to the average everyday player. It was specifically designed to be for casuals while still adding enough depth and complexity for those who grew up as gamers or new gamers who were more hardcore. because back then, gaming still wasn't mainstream. I remember the days when there was no such thing as difficulty levels. Games only had one difficulty back then: brutal. They were often unforgiving, obtuse, and convoluted, with no hand-holding in sight. The game wasn't designed to help you figure things out, offer you lower difficulty, or give out hints like candy. You either had to rise to the challenge and figure it out on your own and actually get good, or you could just give up and never finish it. That's just how it was, which was good in a lot of ways, because it made games challenging and fun, and actually kept it more of a niche hobby for a long time, which I could go on a long diatribe about, but I think that's a video for another day. Anyway, the point is that this was designed specifically as a casual experience, so by definition, perfect balance wasn't even a priority. And why would it be? If it's casual, it's for fun, and people with a casual attitude wouldn't go around crying about a 0.01% balance difference. Obviously, there was a lot more disparity than that at the time, but I'm referring more to the current attitude a lot of people seem to have when it comes to the game. With all these things in mind, the lack of balance, both in the beginning and moving forward, makes perfect sense. Why would they focus on flawlessly balancing the game when it wasn't even part of their design philosophy in the first place? Well, they wouldn't. And I think for many, this realization sort of uncovers why things were that way from the start and why things are the way they are today. But wait a minute, that's just early World of Warcraft. The game's been running for 2 decades now. Surely things have changed over a period of 20 years. Yes, that's absolutely correct. And that's what I'll be digging into next. So now we're all on the same page in terms of original design philosophy, and at least some of the thought process behind the choices Blizzard made. But what about in subsequent years when expansions released and the game evolved? Well, that's where things start to get really complicated. As things progressed and endgame became more of a thing, the design philosophy began to shift, not just based on the gameplay and Blizzard's design alone, but because of the evolving player base. Vanilla and its casual philosophy made perfect sense for a largely new audience who was experiencing all of this for the first time. But with the release of the Burning Crusade and onward, things were starting to become more established. You can only be a noob for so long before you become an actual gamer, and when that happens, your approach inevitably changes. You aren't just wandering around aimlessly anymore, trying to figure things out and goofing off. With the vast majority of the player base now at level cap and sitting in the endgame phase, the focus naturally had to shift more to endgame content and a level cap focused playstyle, which meant that the core purpose of the game shifted dramatically. It wasn't about exploring the world and learning your class anymore. Now that you had that experience, it was time to actually master your class, and in the pursuit of mastery, especially against other players, whether that be in PvE or PvP, the mentality inevitably shifts from one of more fun and playful exploration to one of competition. As competition rises, the casual mindset fades more and more, until it disappears entirely, and that's what we saw as WoW progressed through its expansions. Now, of course, there were those who didn't like this change and who wanted to keep things the way they were when the game first released, which is completely understandable, but also part of the issue. This made the attempt at balancing even more difficult right from the beginning, because on the one end, you have the casuals who are taking their time and still figuring things out, and on the other, you have a player base that is constantly evolving and becoming more accustomed to the game, their respective classes, and the expectations of how the game should work, and also by extension, becoming more competitive because now progression through the world is replaced by progression with your specific class. To get the same feeling of satisfaction that the game used to provide, the player has to find a new outlet for progression, which they now find in the mastery of their class. Hence, the increasingly competitive nature of the game, as everyone skills up and becomes increasingly more focused on performance. In order to adapt to this evolution, Blizzard now has to focus more on class balance, because now that the game is more class-focused, the disparity between these different classes now becomes far more important, and their respective weaknesses far more damaging for those who found themselves at the bottom of the power ladder. But the problem is, this isn't the game they set out to make. On the one hand, you have to roll with the punches and adapt to the player base, because that's the nature of an MMO. But how do you stay true to your ideals and your original design philosophy while also keeping the player base satisfied? Not only that, but now you likely have a dividing line not only in the player community, but even within your own company culture, as there are likely those who consider themselves more forward-thinking and wanted to shift the game to where the player base was taking it, and those who wanted to preserve what made World of Warcraft special in the first place. With the initial design of casual fun baked into the very core of the game, they were already on the back foot in terms of shifting the game to focus on class balance purely from a design standpoint. It must have seemed like an impossible task to take something so massive and unwieldy and try to make fundamental changes while also keeping the thing running. Think about it. For anyone that knows anything about game development, it's not so easy to take all this code you created with specific intentions and with specific design choices built into it, and then just change it into something else entirely. Now, imagine if you were only given a year or maybe two to do that. It would be quite a tall order. To up the ante even more, imagine trying to do that while also creating new content and keeping the game up and running live, while also making sure that all these massive changes to this massive game won't just break the thing entirely and render it unplayable. Now add to that the ambiguity and internal struggle of not wanting to lose the original soul of the game, while also trying to address the shifting focus of the experience to more competitive play. Does it sound impossible yet? Well, this is just the beginning. I'm sure there was plenty of internal discussion about trying to maintain the original flavor and making World of Warcraft a welcoming place for the casual players, while still catering to the ever-growing base of more mature gamers who began to expect more out of the experience. My main takeaway from all of this is that Blizzard was already so far on the back foot in terms of making these changes based on the original design that it made it almost impossible for them to stay ahead of the problem and address the issues moving forward. But this would only compound over time as they added new features and the game became increasingly complex. Every time they added new level caps and new abilities, they had to rebalance the game to account for all those alterations. Every new race meant rebalancing the racials with all the other aspects of the game, and every new class meant rebalancing the game entirely. This sort of creates a danged if you do, danged if you don't situation, where they have to create new content to keep the game fresh and exciting, but every time they do, it makes the task of balancing the game more and more complicated, and the goal of equal power between classes more and more out of reach. Now, compound this over 20 years. There's so much to deal with here. You have to account for a long-standing player base with deep connections to their classes and characters. That means that you're already somewhat limited in the changes that you can make because you still have to hold to the original design from 20 years ago to some extent. Otherwise, you'll alienate long-term players, but if you don't update the class enough that they fit into the modern version of the game, they end up just being left behind because they aren't viable. It would be incredibly difficult to balance these aspects of only a single race and class over such an extended period of time, let alone a dozen or more, as it becomes increasingly difficult to create new abilities that still fit within the lore, theme, and the existing framework and fantasy of the class, while also maintaining the unique, distinct playstyle and flavor of each specific class, while also offering enough change that it feels new and exciting. And every time you lock that in, it's only a matter of time before you have to do it all over again. That would be bad enough, but then add in every other class in the game that you have to balance against each other, and every single spec of each class, and racials on top of that, and we can start to see how balancing the game becomes essentially impossible. At this point, Blizzard is in a position where the constant race to balance this ever-increasing workload is becoming harder and harder, and so new abilities are added to address disparity in certain classes, but as a result, over time, all the classes begin to lose their identity. So what do they do to resolve this problem? They add hero talents to bring back the character fantasy, but now that means they've essentially added 2 new specs to each class. How can this ever be balanced? The answer is, it can't. Perfect balance just isn't possible, and even though I find myself frustrated with the constant buffs and nerfs, when you really sit down and take the time to put it into perspective, it's actually a miracle that the game is as balanced as it currently is. But I haven't even addressed what may be the biggest issue, which is the massive change to the core gameplay. What's more important than the balancing itself is the design intent driving that balance, or in other words, what aspect of the game are they basing their balancing efforts on? This brings us to the different content forms in modern WoW. Where it used to just be PvE versus PvP, now we have so many different offshoots of these 2 pillars of gameplay, the balancing becomes even more impossible. In the PvP sphere, we have World PvP, Battlegrounds, Arena, and Rated Battlegrounds. These all function in fundamentally different ways, and what's considered balanced in one game form is completely broken in another. For example, what is underpowered in Arena may be completely broken in Rated Battlegrounds. As a specific example that pertains to this moment in time, Mistweaver monks are considered trash healers in Arena, but totally busted in Rated Battlegrounds. Now, consider the PvE elements, we have to account for everything we discussed earlier, plus dungeons, heroics, raids, and Mythic Plus. Every class has to be viable in each of these modes, while not overpowering all the others. Since all these different game modes have core differences in design, with different objectives and goals, it means that for every class to remain viable in these different situations, their abilities and playstyles have to be adapted specifically to the objectives of that game mode. But if they are strong in one mode, they will almost assuredly be lacking in another. So, whatever mode of play the game is balanced around will be the most equal in terms of power, while the rest suffer. With this in mind, there's really no way out. Really, the only solution would be to separate these, but then that's essentially juggling multiple games instead of one. It would be twice the work or more for each class, race, and spec combination. Even just thinking about it is exhausting. So when we break it down and consider all the pieces at play here, I actually feel kind of bad for the devs. They're between a rock and a hard place, and it really is a tough problem to try and tackle. I'm just as baffled by how to resolve the issue myself, so I can only imagine how the devs feel. So, with all that said, this is where all my points have led. I set out to prove why I think it's impossible to achieve balance with the current design, and I think I have. When accounting for the sheer amount of content in World of Warcraft, I truly believe that complete game balance is impossible, and I think it's unreasonable to expect that. But I do think decent balance can be achieved if the focus is placed in a specific area. The drawback is that other modes of play will be disproportionately impacted. Maybe the best we could hope for is two forms of balancing, one for PvE and one for PvP, and then we would have to be willing to accept that some modes within these two spheres of gameplay will be inherently less balanced than the others. Either way, taking the time to understand what Blizzard is up against in the current iteration of World of Warcraft makes me feel a lot better about the struggle with game balance, and I appreciate that the devs are making an effort to improve where they can. Hopefully, we can find a solution that works for everyone. Now that you know my thoughts on the matter, I'd like to hear your thoughts on different approaches to game balance and any ideas you might have for a way to solve this issue.